everybody, this is Paul with Modern Driveline. Today we're going to go through the steps of how to install your transmission and everything you need to do before you install your transmission. You can check out that document on our website, moderndriveline.com. We're going to start by showing you this beautiful Coyote engine that we've already installed our pilot bushing into the crank and positioned our QuickTime bell housing block plate. Of course, the first thing you want to make sure of is everything is clean. We've cleaned the surface of the block plate, all of our holes for our flywheel, and our crank trigger sensor that we're now going to position, followed by the flywheel. You may also be able to see we have put on some of the ARP surface lubricant that is recommended when it comes with the ARP bolt pack, and that provides a slipping sensation underneath the head of the bolt. This material does not go on the threads. You use 242 Loctite medium strength for that. Now that we've got our flywheel positioned, we're going to put some thread locker onto our threads of the ARP bolts. Okay, now that we've got our ARP bolts done, we're also going to do the threads on the crank. Just put a little dollop in there, that way you've got Loctite going in both directions and it's not just seeping back onto the threads on the bolt, but it's actually in the threads in the flywheel and in the crank. All right, now we have finished pre-lubing with Loctite our threads and our bolts. Now we're going to do our installation. And we've already pre-aligned our flywheel, which makes this really nice and easy to get our bolt started and put in. Per the manufacturer's instructions, we're going to be torquing these to 70 foot-pounds. You do this in an alternating pattern and make sure that it is a moving torque when you apply the wrench to it and it clicks off. Okay, now that we've torqued off all of our bolts and we've gone around it one more time, we're going to clean the surface that remains with all of this lubricant because we don't want it flailing out and possibly getting onto our clutch. So make everything clean as possible. Now we're going to install the pressure plate ring for the RST twin disc clutch by McLeod. You're going to position your bottom disc. There is a flywheel side and a non-flywheel side, so do position correctly. We have pre-installed the dowel pins into our flywheel because this particular ring requires it. Certain clutches do require rings, others do not. Be very careful and pay attention to that. And as always, you want to make sure your bolts will thread into the holes that you are going to use for your pressure plate. Always check every bolt by hand in every hole to make sure there's not a manufacturing defect or a mismatch of the bolt to the flywheel or to a pressure plate. Those things will save you a lot of hassle and damaged components. We've already pre-lubricated our ARP bolts per the instructions provided by ARP, and now we're going to install all of our pressure plate bolts into the flywheel. Here we've just finished installing the pressure plate or retaining ring bolts, in this case, into the flywheel. Now we're going to torque them to 50 foot-pounds. Next up, we want to go ahead and remove our alignment tool from our bottom disc and position it with our top disc. Again, we have a bottom disc as you're looking at it and a top disc as you're looking at it. And on the opposite, they say flywheel side. Pay attention to positioning, very important. Get everything lined up and installed. Now we're ready to install our pressure plate. Again, like everything else, you want to make sure all of your surfaces are clean to remove any machining oils that may have been on the surfaces when they were new, and clean those until there's no black residue coming off whatsoever. In this particular case, because this is a twin disc and we have this additional separator plate, you can see we've got this strap here. It's very important. The positioning of your pressure plate clears those things. Next up, we've got 6 flat washers and 6 lock washers that we'll be installing onto our plate per the instructions, and then we'll be torquing those to 25 foot-pounds. Now we have all of our washers and nuts installed onto our pressure plate. We're going to start running down our pressure plate in an alternating pattern with just a regular hand ratchet. But before we do this, you want to make sure that your discs are free to move and your spline tool can roll in and out. So we've got a little bit of pressure on our bolts here when we put them in by hand, and we're going to try and center this as best as possible. Let's loosen that and recheck it. Okay, the idea is you want the discs centered well so that this just slides in and out, and then you start your torquing process. As you're torquing your bolts down, you want to check this incrementally to make sure it's not tightened up. If it did, you want to regroup, reposition, so that when you take this out after you've done your alignment, the transmission will slide in very easily. All right, we now have our pressure plate torqued to our mounting plate. And now we're going to torque this to the manufacturer's recommended torque value of 25 foot-pounds. As you notice, our alignment tool slips in and out real easily. That's going to make our transmission installation go quick. We have finished installing our clutch assembly and we're getting ready to install our bell housing. I wanted to point out one thing on our clutch set here. Notice we have a little mark right here on the ring, and we also have a mark on the pressure plate. Those two things should align. So pay attention to all of the instructions that are included with any product to make sure that you get your installation as proper as possible. Additionally, for our bell housing, when we did our alignment, we did not talk about the availability of these offset dowel pins, which will help align your bell housing should you have a run-out condition on the inside of this gold or silver ring back here. For out of parallel conditions, you do want to give someone a call. I would say start with us. Now we're ready to install our bell housing. For this installation, we have a cable-style clutch fork that's being used for an external actuation system. In the Modern Driveline, before you install your transmission document, we do talk about that. I'm just going to point out some things that you do want to make sure you get lubricated before you install this system. You want to lubricate underneath the throwout bearing. You want to lubricate the bore of your throwout bearing. You also want to lubricate underneath the pivot stud of your throwout bearing. You do not lubricate the face. You do not lubricate the splines of the transmission under any circumstances. And you do not lubricate pilot bushings. You only lubricate pilot bearings that have exposed needle bearings. If you have a pilot bearing that has an inner race, no exposed needle bearings, no lubrication. For the ones that do have exposed needles, just a pinky's worth of high pressure grease in there will do the job. Now we're ready to install our bell housing. Once positioned, go ahead and put in all of your bolts. Okay, we've just set up our mic after installing our bell housing and torquing all of our bolts. That's very important to make sure that you get a good clamp on the bell housing and it's secure before you start your run-out checks on the bell housing. So there's 2 checks to perform on the bell housing. We're showing you the setup of the tooling for the first one. The first one that we're doing is the radial run-out of the ring here. So you are allowed up to 10 thousandths total dial run out divided by 2 is 5 thousandths radial run out. You'll see that in the Modern Driveline before you install your transmission document instructions, which you can again find on our website, moderndriveline.com. So here you see the tool setup. We have our dial indicator against the inside edge of where we're going to be mounting our transmission. So that's going to be our first check. Now we're going to set up and show you how to set up the tooling to do the second check on the face of the bell housing. All right, we just finished setting up for our radial run out here. Now we're going to check our surface run out. As you can see, the tool is now set up on this surface of our bell housing. The idea here is to make sure that it is perpendicular or parallel, depending on how you're reading it, with the back of the block more importantly, the crank. So when you position the bell housing, your pilot tip is not this way or that way. It's actually centered to the pilot bushing in the crank. So this is how you set up the tool to check that, and then you'll have someone turn the motor by hand and check as the tool goes around. You're looking for your dial indicator to read a difference. Again, you've got to pay attention to that crank thrust whenever you're checking this measurement. Refer to the Modern Driveline document that we referred to in the prior segment. Okay, we have finished the installation of our QuickTime bell housing and we are ready to install our transmission. But before we do, we have 3 final things to check. We're going to check the penetration clearance of our pilot tip to the back of our crank. We're going to check the clearance of our splines to the pilot bushing, and we're also going to check the clearance of our guide tube or bearing retainer to our clutch disc hub. So I'm going to use a 12-inch set of dial calipers, and we're just using this as a depth gauge, and we're going to go all the way in to the end of our crank, and using our straight edge, we're going to bring that to 0. And we're going to carefully remove our tool, turn it around, and we are going to check from the face of the transmission, not any deep pockets that may be part of the transmission, and we're going to look for this being deeper than that, and we got plenty of clearance to the back of our crank. For our next check, we're going to check to the face of the pilot bushing so that we make sure we clear our clutch disc splines. So we are set up against our pilot bushing using our straight edge. We're going to bring this down to 0. Looks good. Again, carefully remove the tool and turn it around. Checking to the transmission mounting surface, we can see that our end of our tool is further away than our splines, so we got plenty of clearance there. You can also see that we're going to have at least 3/8 of an inch of engagement on our pilot bushing and our pilot tip, so we're good in that regard as well. Next and last, we're going to check our clutch disc hub clearance to our guide tube. Now this one's a little trickier because you got to hold it in position on the highest edge of your clutch disc hub. Again, bringing that to 0, turning it around, you can see that our tool is again higher than our end of our guide tube. Got about 1/4 inch of clearance there. So all of our clearance checks are good. Now we're ready to install our transmission. Now that we've positioned our transmission, we want to talk about one final important step, and that is to not draw in your transmission with the bolts. As you can see here, we've got some clearance between our transmission and our bell housing, and I want to show you what should happen. Thud. Goes all the way in easily, and then you'll start your bolts. We know that we don't have a problem with any interferences, so we're not going to be jamming in that last 1/16 of an inch. This also is verified that our sizing ring on our bell housing matches our transmission, and we don't have an interference there either. Now that you've gotten this far, you're ready to put in your bolts. You're going to have 100% success with everything that's installed in the bell housing. Congratulations, and we'll see you soon.